So HAI is currently working on human trafficking in a number of different countries throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see from the map, we're currently working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, along the border with Burundi. We're working in northeast Nigeria, and we're also, we have lighter programs that are focused on Swaziland and Cameroon. We've been working in the area of human trafficking since about 2008. Our programs in the DR Congo are sort of our longest running programs in the area of human trafficking. And that's really where our most holistic approach is focused, and where you can see sort of all of the elements of HAI's programming within one specific sort of package of services for survivors of trafficking. So that's where we work on the issues of mental health, where we work on access to justice, and just general reintegration and rehabilitation of survivors. We've been active in Nigeria since about 2008, working on primarily on issues of HIV and LGBT rights. More recently, in the past couple of years, we've also been working on the issue of human trafficking within the context of the Lake Chad Basin crisis. So when we talk about the Lake Chad Basin, what we're talking about is northeast Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and northern Cameroon. So really, when you talk about the Boko Haram crisis or the Lake Chad Basin crisis, you hear Nigeria quite a bit, but it's actually really a multinational conflict that spills across borders and involves a lot of different countries. So that's what I'll be talking about when I say Lake Chad Basin. As Senator Durbin mentioned, there was a lot of publicity, albeit fleeting, around 276 girls who were kidnapped. But really, that sort of doesn't speak to the larger issue, which is thousands of children being abducted within the context of a larger conflict. So we're looking at a context where there are 2.6 million people displaced throughout the region. And so often these particular individuals sort of get lost within the larger humanitarian response. So HAI recently, about a year ago now, we conducted an assessment. Scott and I were actually both present for this assessment in northeast Nigeria to look at issues around human trafficking. What we found was that there's actually an agency that's entirely devoted within the Nigerian government, the National Agency for the Prohibition of Trafficking in Person. But what we found was that they're really not responsive to issues of trafficking within the conflict. So like Scott mentioned, there's lots of different examples of human trafficking, but what we found was that they're not really responsive to issues of child soldiers. They're not responsive to abductions by armed groups and forced marriage. So that was really where the bulk of the gaps we identified were. And so we found ourselves working, rather than working with the anti-trafficking agency, although we continue to coordinate with them and try to get them more involved, we've really been working more with the Ministry of Women's Affairs and Social Development, which was much more responsive to these issues in the Northeast. And whenever possible, we try to work with governments and civil society who are already present in these countries to build their capacity. And when that isn't possible, we're willing and able to provide services directly. So, Linda, I think, was going to talk a little bit about our response to some of these gaps that were identified.
Thank you, Michael. So psychosocial needs and mental health needs were a huge thing that was identified in the assessments. And so our response is really in 4 areas. One is developing mental health and a psychosocial guide, and that will be translated into the local languages in Northeast Nigeria, which is Hausa. The other thing is providing training for service providers, especially in trauma-informed approaches to serving victims and survivors. The other thing that our project is going to be doing is conducting community education programs and awareness, just because we feel that with more people being aware of what is happening, then we can have more identification of victims and referrals for services for reintegration and also rehabilitation. The other key thing that is important that we're doing, because this is a regional project, is facilitating conversation between states. So we started out in Bono, But now we're looking to go into Yobe and Adamawa as well as Cameroon. It's not very highlighted there, but it's just northern Cameroon. So one of the things we're doing now, in fact, our field officer has gone over to Borno to kind of facilitate relationships and ensure that those states are talking to each other so that we don't have to duplicate things over and over. They can learn from each other. So that's kind of what we're doing in terms of the Lake Chad Basin area.
So to sort of highlight the difference, the different forms of trafficking, and really just how diverse of a continent Sub-Saharan Africa really is, we're going to take you from the most populous country in Africa, Nigeria, down to our programs in Swaziland, which you can see in the blue in the sort of southeast corner of the continent. So we actually, at the same time that we were conducting assessments in Nigeria around the Lake Chad Basin conflict, we were also conducting assessments in Swaziland at the to respond to a request for technical assistance by the Swaziland government. So during our assessment, one of the things, what we noticed was that unlike Nigeria, where we saw that the National Trafficking Agency was really not very responsive to the issues that we were noticing, here we actually found a national anti-trafficking agency that was almost over-responsive and overzealous to the detriment of the survivors and the victims. What we found was that the government of Swaziland was so focused on obtaining prosecutions that they really were abusing the rights of the victims. So I met with a few different victims who had come from neighboring countries such as Mozambique or Lesotho, and they had been in what was being referred to as a shelter for almost a year, but really this was essentially a de facto prison. These people, despite the human rights violations they had experienced, they weren't allowed to come and go. Nobody was told that they had a right to stand trial, or that they had a right to choose whether they wanted to stand trial. So they were actually being held essentially in prisons. Meanwhile, the perpetrators were actually free to come and go at their will. And some of them came from neighboring countries such as South Africa and had already gone back to their home countries. So really, it was really an example of a well-meaning sort of government initiative that had really sort of gone awry. So again, I'll let Linda talk about some of our response to some of these gaps.
So we are headed to Swaziland next week. Myself and Christy, our Access to Justice technical advisor. And part of it is to help rectify this problem, which in one way is good, but we want to make sure that whenever frontline workers and judges and law enforcement and are coming in contact with victims, that they're being conscious of re-victimizing and re-traumatizing those victims. And so Christy and I are developing curriculum, and we are going in next week to train judges and law enforcement officers and frontline workers on how to approach victims and ensure that they're not being re-victimized. We will return in September just to follow up and make sure that what we are presenting is sustainable and making an impact.
I think we're going to turn it over now to Scott to talk about some of our